Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. On Monday, China warned other countries to not curb their trade with China in an attempt to curry favor with US President Trump. Joining us to discuss this political landscape on a global level is Liana Fix. She is a fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. She has an expertise on Germany and European foreign policy, but also European China policy. Liana, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invite.
So, US China trade relations has been a major point of news over the last several weeks, really ever since Liberation Day. But let's set the stage from your perspective as a European expert. Can you kind of describe what the last few weeks have been like for European countries as America has announced these massive tariffs?
Yeah, so first of all, Europeans themselves are, of course, affected by the tariffs. Donald Trump has also announced tariffs on the European Union. Now, the administration has been saying they're hopeful that a deal can be struck soon because the EU market is obviously a big market for the US side. But then the problems between the US and China, the wildly escalating trade and tariff war between the US and China, and the fact that they are still looking for an exit strategy out of this escalation spiral also has implications for Europe. Because if China doesn't have access to the US market anymore, and China has become an export superpower, something that Germany has been in the past, has now been taken over by China. China is exporting massively and has huge overcapacities in many industrial goods and many consumer goods. China will look for other markets if it can't export to the United States. And Europe is concerned that it's going to be the one market that is still open and going to be flooded by Chinese product that can't be sold anymore to the United States.
That's really interesting. So, what do you make of China's announcement on Monday that it basically is warning people, don't team up against us in order to curry favor with President Trump? Putting that in super layman's terms, by the way.
Yeah, so Beijing has been pursuing a policy of carrots and sticks towards its own partners. The carrots policy is that since the election of Donald Trump, there has been a charm offensive from Beijing. Beijing was talking about the need to uphold the multilateral order together with Beijing against the United States, which obviously rings a little bit hollow given that China has itself contributed to undermine that order. But there's also a stick side, and the stick side is what we see now, threats by China not to try to curry favors with the United States. It's actually a confusing situation because many have expected that the Trump administration and Trump himself will take on a pretty aggressive stance towards Beijing. That's not what they have been doing. There are hawks in this administration that would like to do that, but President Trump himself has not reached out to allies across the globe saying, hey, we all need to contain China together. He has maintained a business idea of relations with China. He has to some extent undermined the US commitment to Taiwan, trying to get the chips production from Taiwan to the United States to make Taiwan less important to the United States. So this has been confusing for allies around the world, and now they are faced with this escalating trade war between the US and China, which they fear can at some point be resolved, and then everything is good again between the US and China, and allies will be left behind. So it's a lot of confusion about what exactly the strategy is behind US-China policy at the moment.
It's interesting that you talk about that confusion on the part of allies because I had a conversation the other week with someone in the context of US Russia relations and is the global order shifting was part of our conversation. We have seen President Trump in his first and second terms speak rather derisively of NATO. And I wonder about your perspective on this question. Is the global West not really a cohesive West anymore? And is that perhaps contributing to this confusion on the trade front?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's this idea that Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping can kind of divide the world among themselves and create their own spheres of influence and do a kind of triumvirate where they had their own little kingdoms where they rule. I'm not sure if that's really a correct reading of what Donald Trump is doing and what he sees. He's not thinking in 20th century Yalta, Stalin, Churchill categories of dividing the world. He's thinking more about, well, I want to be on the same level as the most powerful people on the world, and I want to do business with them. So that's the very basic instinct that where he is coming from. But since he is conflating trade and tariffs with security, that makes allies particularly nervous. With Japan, he's talking about trade and tariffs, but also about Japanese security. Europeans have a very important NATO summit coming up at the end of June in The Hague. A trade and tariff war with Trump will not be looked at separately from that. The administration is looking through all that through one lens. And for Europe, that lens is obviously a free rider lens you're not paying up. So this linkage between trade and tariffs, between security, between questions about US reliability as an ally, are all coming together into one mix, which again makes it incredibly difficult to negotiate, especially for an entity like the European Union, which is only focused on negotiating trade. And everything else in Europe on security is done by NATO.
That's really interesting. So just to emphasize what you just said, the conflation of trade and tariffs with security is an almost uniquely American perspective, or is that a uniquely Trumpian perspective?
Necessarily unique. Others are doing that too. China, for example, has used a lot of economic pressure to pursue its security interests. It has pressured European countries to not support Taiwan and so on. So it's not entirely unique, but it is pretty new for the United States that these things are put together in a coercive way and in a mixture of threats. In the past, usually trade and security have been seen separately from each other and have been dealt separately with each other.
Now, you talk about how President Trump has not engaged with allies to negotiate with China. It is very much a US-China conversation exclusively. What do you think will happen next? And what is the move on behalf of European leaders here?
The Europeans have taken a cautious approach because they do understand that security and trade is interlinked for them. So they have said, well, we can be tough. We have the means to be tough. They have just fined Meta and then Google. So the whole digital realm is also an instrument of power that the European Union can wield. But they have also signaled that they are willing to be constructive in discussions with the United States. One problem that the Europeans, and especially the European Commission, which does the trade part for all Europeans, sees is that those negotiations about trade and tariff usually are incredibly complex. They take a long, long time whenever you try to negotiate something between countries. So that approach to do a break almost about 3 months seems for every serious trade negotiator almost ridiculous because 3 months are not enough to negotiate between partners, and especially not if you have like dozens of partners behind a line who also want to negotiate. So it remains to be seen how deep the negotiations will go, or if in the end we will just have some very broad results that are presented as a success, but actually in substance may mean less than we think.
That's an interesting point on the timeline. I've heard investors say something similar. That 90-day pause that some were calling for was the bare minimum in this scenario. Based on your studies and your area of focus, what can you say about President Xi's mindset right now? And what do you project as the likelihood for him to negotiate or change terms?
So what we've seen is a very principled Chinese stance. So they did not want to go in line with all the others who called President Trump, to go into negotiations. There is a strong feeling of pride and respect that has to be respected on both sides there, on the side of President Trump and on the side of President Xi Jinping. And there's strong conviction that China will not bow to US pressure to the same extent as other countries do. This has also to do with China's own self-perception of its role in the world. But on the other side, there's also a lot of nervousness in Beijing because the United States has behaved so differently than they knew from past US administrations, even from the first Trump administration. Let's, for example, take the war against Ukraine, where China is supporting Russia and allowing Russia to continue this war. Suddenly, Russia and the United States are doing a kind of rapprochement, which leaves China, the traditional partner of Russia, weirdly on the sidelines, although it played this important role in supporting Russia's war, which makes Beijing nervous. The rapprochement being excluded from any ceasefire negotiations. That's an additional example that shows that also from Beijing's perspective, there's a strong idea that China will not just be bullied around, but also a strong nervousness about what's actually the whole plan and strategy behind this.
As we think about plans, strategies, and next steps, you mentioned a NATO meeting at the end of June. What are the other events on the calendar that might prove important diplomatic moments, either for the US, China, Europe, or all entities together?
Yeah, so basically, all have to make it somehow to the summer. And if we reach that point, that would all be good because it's the G7 meeting. And again, there is the NATO summit at the end of June in The Hague. And the conflation, as I said before, of the trade and tariff issue with security discussions will be. Plus, you have also ongoing Ukraine ceasefire discussions, which can also have implications on how the Trump administration views Europe and its allies. So that's something until the end of June to look out for the G7 meeting, the NATO meeting. But certainly unexpected events are with this administration and in this world to be expected.
And are there any meetings between the EU and China on the books? I'm wondering if Beijing's Monday announcement about don't collaborate with the Americans provoked an opposite reaction, wherein countries are now calling Beijing to make deals with Beijing.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. There is an EU-China summit, which is planned. Originally, Xi Jinping was expected to come to Brussels. Probably now the Europeans will come to Beijing. That is planned for July, and that again will have a big questions for Europeans if they take the summit and the preparations for that as basically an opportunity to show to the United States, well, look, we have alternatives. We don't have to work with you. That's something that has been advocated by some in Europe. They say we can't afford a two-front trade war with the United States and China. Let's get closer to China. They are more reasonable at the moment. There's little to lose for us. In reality, there is a lot to lose. So there's a risk that Europeans might see China in naive terms again, just because they are so frustrated with Donald Trump. Because again, China's overcapacity challenge is a huge challenge for European industries, at least as big as Trump's tariff challenge. And then again, China is also a threat to Europe's security through its support for Russia's war. So it is an easy temptation to go in and see China as Europe's answer to Donald Trump. But that's something that Europeans should proceed with care.
Much, much caution. Is there an upside scenario and a downside that you're looking at, or a bull case and a bear case, to use Wall Street terms? Again, it's a crystal ball question, but I'm curious where your head is on this.
So the upside scenario is definitely that we will see a negotiated outcome on the tariffs and trade questions between the EU and the US, which could be beneficial to both sides. We'll see some great successes for the United States, some major investments and so on. Something that Juncker, the former Commission president, has done during first Trump's term, where he basically convinced Trump that he has done a great deal with Europe. So that's certainly what Europe is hoping for, that they will be able to achieve. There's hope that if they go into the NATO summit with increased defense spending and so on, that will prevent the United States and Donald Trump from basically turning his back on NATO. And they hope that in Ukraine ceasefire negotiations, Russia will fall into its own trap and risk the patience of Donald Trump. So that's the best case outline. The worst case outline is everything explodes. The United States threatens its allies, threatens the Europeans with, well, you are not being helpful on trade and tariffs, you're not being helpful on Ukraine, you're exploiting us on NATO, we will walk away from all of that. That would be the maximum worst case scenario that I would see.
Well, I guess we have no choice but to perhaps hold our breath or maybe try to breathe through the next few months. But in the meantime, Liana Fix, fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations, thank you so much for joining us and breaking down the global trade and negotiation landscape. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.